Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. The story of Pandora. Long ago, there was a time when all humans were male. There were no women, and men lived naked and uncivilized around the world. Humans were weak compared to many wild animals. They had no fur to keep them warm, and no thick skin for protection. They weren't equipped with large teeth or the ability to fly to escape. Then one day, the Titan Prometheus decided to intervene on behalf of these fragile beings. Prometheus stole the secret of fire from the gods and gifted it to humanity. This marked a great advantage for men, one that surpassed any advantage bestowed upon other species. The gift of fire provided not only comfort and protection, but also sparked the first step towards the acquisition of knowledge and the taming of nature. With these came culture and civilization. The gift of fire was a spark of divinity given to men. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Also, we launched a Patreon page for those of you who wish and can support this project and get more of it. If you join it, you will get various new things, like the possibility to listen to all episodes with background sounds, regular bonus episodes. There are already 2 bonus episodes available, one about the history of glassmaking and stained glass, and the other one is the mysterious story about the man in the iron mask. And one more will be published this month. In Patreon, you will be able to download all these audios, and you will also have your say on the choices of topics, advanced releases, and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. And for those of you who wish to listen to our stories in Spanish, we invite you to listen to La Biblioteca de los Sueños. You will find links in the description box and the first comment under the video. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Release the tension in your facial muscles too, and allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. Now let's continue our story. For this theft, the fire awarded to men as a gift, Prometheus was harshly punished. This is a story of the king of gods, Zeus, and how he enchanted revenge on Prometheus. But he still wasn't satisfied. Humanity, too, had to face the consequences, or at least be restrained. They couldn't be entrusted solely with the newfound knowledge of fire, something that would undoubtedly multiply their power in the future and perhaps lead them to defy the gods one day. Sometimes Zeus preferred swift and brutal revenge, but at other times he relished devising intricate schemes that would gradually unfold. This time he chose the latter. Humanity would be punished, but this punishment would be the consequences of their own actions, and they would eventually diminish into oblivion. For the first phase of this plan, Zeus approached Hephaestus, the craftsman and black goldsmith god who lived in seclusion, away from most of the other gods. His own mother, Hera, had thrown him off Mount Olympus, the abode of the gods, because of his lameness. Therefore, Hephaestus turned to work in his workshop, keenly interested in the adventures and quarrels of other gods. He crafted equipment for them, objects that were as perfect and beautifully made as he was deemed unattractive. These items included the winged helmet and sandals of Hermes, the messenger gods, and the chariot of Helios, the sun god. Zeus sought out the reclusive Hephaestus and requested that he sculpt a new creature, a human woman. The first woman ever was created from clay. Hephaestus modeled the body, and life was breathed into it. Humans were not created to be perfect, and how could this be when they were brought into existence by gods who were themselves imperfect? However, an effort was made for this first woman, or so it seemed. Each god contributed by bestowing her with unique gifts: beauty, intelligence, eloquence, and strength. She received all these qualities and was named Pandora, the all-gifted. However, these gifts were ambivalent and double-edged, and this ambiguity was part of Zeus's plan. Hermes endowed Pandora with intelligence and eloquence. But alongside these gifts, the messenger god also infused her with a shameless mind and a deceitful nature. Notably, Hermes gave Pandora the ability to lie convincingly. Aphrodite, in turn, blessed Pandora with grace and attractiveness, causing men to lose their senses and judgment in her presence. Thus Pandora emerged as a creature who was as beautiful and intelligent as she was dangerous and unpredictable. This was the devastating weapon that Zeus had meticulously crafted to diminish and punish men. Once his creation was complete, the king of gods approached Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, offering Pandora to him as his wife. Before he was punished and chained to a mountain for bringing fire to humanity, Prometheus had warned his brother, warned him to never accept a gift from Zeus, because he knew the king of gods never gave away favors and gifts without hidden motives. Epimetheus was charmed by Pandora and forgot about his brother's warning. He accepted her. As a parting gift, Zeus had given Pandora a large jar, a pithos, in which the god had put different plagues. Some were physical, like storms, diseases, or earthquakes. Others were material or emotional, like fear, desperation, or delusion. The supreme god was confident that Pandora's nature would ensure the rest. He believed that she would soon disseminate these plagues because she would carelessly open the jar. Unable to resist the temptation to do so, simply because she could, and he was correct. Soon, despite being instructed not to open the jar, Pandora became curious about its contents. She was unable to resist the temptation for long. As soon as she opened the jar, all the plagues it contained proliferated around the world and began to afflict her species. Though she rushed to close the container, only one thing was left behind, usually translated as hope, though it could also have the pessimistic meaning of deceptive expectation. The story I just told you is one of the most famous versions of the Greek myth, and we owe it to Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet. Thought to have been active between the 8th and the 7th centuries BC, he was a contemporary to Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like with Homer, it is uncertain whether Hesiod actually existed as a single individual, or if he was a pseudo-author, a name to which different works were attributed. You have certainly heard of the term Pandora's box. This is what the figure of Pandora is most famous for. To open Pandora's box means to unleash disasters out of carelessness or an excess of curiosity, resulting in irreversible actions. These calamities or consequences, once released, are here to stay. They are like toothpaste. Once out, they won't go back into the tube. The origin of the phrase lies in ancient times, but in all ancient versions of the myth, as written by Hesiod and later retold by Greek and Roman authors, it was not a box that was open, but a pithos, that is to say, a kind of large amphora, a container that was used for storage. The concept transformed into a box much later, around the time of the Renaissance, 2,000 years after the earliest known written versions of the story. This came about when pithos was translated to box, and the term lived on. However, this is a technical detail that does not alter the fundamental implication of the story. There is a lot to unpack in this myth. At the surface level, it serves as a cautionary tale about careless actions. Moreover, it represents an attempt to explain or make sense of the presence of evil in the world, delving deep into the human condition. You might have also noticed the familiar storyline of the first woman created after the first man, who inadvertently lets evil into the world, driven by impulses she cannot control. This narrative bears a striking resemblance to the story from the Hebrew and the Christian Bibles, where Eve accepts a gift that leads to the expulsion of humanity from Eden, marking the end of her golden age and rendering it forever irretrievable. Another aspect that deserves discussion is that the figure of Pandora is not confined to just this one myth. Greek myths about Pandora exist in different versions, some of which are contradictory. Additionally, Pandora was also the name of an ancient goddess or mythical being. As you see, there are many facets to this ostensibly simple story, and we're going to approach them one by one. Like many myths, the story of Pandora invites various interpretations or can be examined from different perspectives. First, there is the most obvious one, the cautionary tale, warning about the consequences of acting carelessly, which can lead to irreversible tragic outcomes. Pandora opens the jar, and the world is forever changed, plagued by afflictions that persist to this day. Now, diving a bit deeper, the tale also explains the presence of evil or suffering in the world, a common function of myths. They seek to make sense of or provide a backstory for phenomena that affects humanity. This particular story can be seen as an example of Theodicity. What does Theodicity mean? The term theodicity is used in philosophy of religion and was coined in the 18th century by a German philosopher, Leibniz. Derived from Greek, it literally translates to vindication of God. The problem that puzzled theologians and philosophers of the time, and even before that, was the problem of evil. How can we reconcile the existence of a God who is all powerful, benevolent, and omniscient with the reality of evil and suffering that persists in the world and in human lives? In other words, why would a God or gods who are all powerful and wish us well allow such things to exist? Theodicity is an argument, or in some cases a backstory, that attempts to reconcile these seemingly incompatible aspects. In many mythologies, there exist one or several stories that explain how evil and pain came to spread across the world, typically marking the end of a mythical golden age, a period of peace and prosperity devoid of suffering, which supposedly existed prior to these events. For many ancient civilizations, like the classical Greece, the presence of evil in the world did not necessarily conflict with their perception of the divine or their concept of gods. They did not believe that their gods were omnipotent or omniscient. In many Greek mythological stories, gods hide information from each other and sometimes act out of ignorance. Moreover, they are not perceived as always benevolent. They could certainly punish humans, even unfairly at times. They had very human passions and desires. In the case of ancient Greece, the Olympian gods were not the creators of the world. They merely resided in it. These gods happened to possess powers and were eternal, but they were not the creators of the universe. As such, to the Greeks, the gods themselves were subject to pain and emotions. They could be petty, cruel, whimsical, and prone to mistakes. The coexistence of these gods with suffering and evil in the world was not theoretically problematic for the ancient Greeks. However, the existence of these myths still indicates a need for backstory, an explanation for why plagues and suffering afflict mankind. In fact, the myth of Pandora's box explains the spread of plagues as a very intentional plan devised by Zeus. It's a punishment, a form of revenge against humanity, designed to humble it. If there is a moral message here, it would likely emphasize the need for humanity to submit to divine decisions and to the forces of nature. These forces made plagues an inseparable part of our human condition. They came from above and should be accepted as such. The problem of evil appears more theoretically complex for subsequent religions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that operate on the belief in a single God. This God is all-powerful, responsible for creating the world we inhabit, for creating mankind, and is also benevolent. Philosophers and theologians from these varying traditions have analyzed this problem and constructed arguments, theodicies, which strive to reconcile a benevolent God and an all-powerful God with the reality of evil. These theodicies can argue that evil or suffering are part of a broader plan working towards a greater good, or that the existence of evil is both a consequence of and a prerequisite for the free will of humans. Different versions of this argument exist, but they generally converge on the following point. Genuine liberty or free will for humans is impossible without the freedom to commit evil or to disregard God's commandments. Hence, eliminating evil would rob humans of their freedom. This is the essence of Theodicy, and the myth of Pandora, as told by Hesiod, is one of the most ancient theories we know of. Returning to more historical considerations, the complex character of Pandora was not Hesiod's invention. Evidence suggests that she was an ancient figure in Greek mythology, existing long before Hesiod rendered the myth in the form I previously outlined. After him, the story was rewritten and adapted many times throughout antiquity. Hesiod utilized a mythological character who, in earlier versions of the myth, was sometimes married to Prometheus, not his brother Epimetheus. In these earlier versions, the jar may have contained only good things for humans. In such context, Pandora would have been a benevolent female, counterpart to Prometheus. The husband stole fire from the gods to give to mankind, with fire serving as a metaphor for knowledge and culture, while the wife, Pandora, distributed blessings to humankind. What supports the existence of this earlier myth is that Pandora's name can mean all gifted, as previously mentioned, but it can also be interpreted as all giving. Both interpretations are compatible with these two versions of the myth, which present her in starkly different roles. Adding weight to the argument for a benevolent Pandora is the fact that she was depicted on ancient artifacts, like pottery, under an alternative name, Anisidora, which translates to she who sends gifts. Therefore, historians believe that while Hesiod's version of the myth has survived through the centuries and is now completely associated with Pandora, ancient Greeks may not have universally viewed her as a negative figure. The two versions of the myth might have coexisted, varying across different periods or regions of the Greek world. An additional observation to note is the strong and overtly misogynistic undertone in Hesiod's story. In summary, the creation of the first woman was framed by Zeus as punishment. Before her, there were only men, and humanity was content. The first woman is portrayed as the individual who introduced disaster. Hesiod's story acknowledges Pandora's qualities, but it insinuates that she cannot be trusted due to her lack of control and reason, compounded by her deceitful nature. She may just be a character, but as the first woman, she clearly also represents an archetype. This makes for an extreme case in Greek mythology. There are many feminine figures in Greek mythology painted in a more positive light. Goddesses like Athena or Aphrodite are generally represented as positive characters, often supporting the heroes we are encouraged to root for. Another archetype is Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is a model of virtue and loyalty. There are also powerful women, like the Amazons, who are warriors. It would be misleading to label every single flaw attributed to women in Greek mythology as a sign of misogyny, given that male characters are also portrayed with significant flaws. All characters in these ancient stories are imperfect, including the gods. But these myths also reflected Greek society at the time. Most often, women in these stories are praised for their beauty, loyalty, caregiving, and childbearing abilities. If they are depicted as positive figures, it's almost always in the context of being a source of inspiration for male heroes. They very rarely drive the story, and when they do, they often appear as ambiguous villains, like Pandora in Hesiod's version, or Medea, a character in the saga of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea was a queen and a sorceress who initially helps Jason but ends disastrously as a murderer, unable to cope when Jason abandons her. In these stories where women are one of the main characters, their lack of control over their impulses and their ambivalence are often highlighted. They are depicted as the bearers of disaster, often unwittingly. Consider also Helen of Troy. Though there are a few exceptions and more ambiguous situations, these character archetypes about women are recurrent. They reflect the position of women in Greek society and also serve to justify it. Women were rarely given any political role. They had fewer rights, and except for a few elite members, they were not given much education. Perhaps one final observation about the myth of Pandora is how it bears similarities to the story of Eve. Eve, the first woman in the world, is central to the narrative of transition from an original state of abundance and ease to a life of suffering. This transition is brought about as a punishment for transgressing a divine command. Pandora opened her jar, and Eve accepted the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, both having ignored explicit warnings not to do so. Did the myth of Pandora inspire the biblical story? Maybe, it's possible. But rather than suggesting Pandora inspired Eve, it could be that this was a common narrative circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Both stories, both figures, might just be illustrations of the same tradition. We know that Greek culture heavily influenced the Levant in the final centuries BC. The classical myth of Pandora was well known to the early Christians, who recognized in her something of an Eve figure. Some historians have argued that Hesiod's interpretation of the myth, which primarily casts Pandora in a negative light, could have influenced the interpretation of Scripture in a way that made the first woman responsible for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Not that Eve or Pandora were inherently bad or had malicious intentions, but they lacked willpower, exhibited frivolity, making them dangerous for themselves and others, and they led men into sin. The belief that women, by their very nature, are more susceptible to sin and are dangerous for that reason has been significantly diminished in modern mainstream Christian and Jewish doctrines. However, only a few centuries ago, it was common for Christians' theology and moral treatises to argue that the inherent nature of women somehow made them more prone to letting evil in, with all the severe implications it carried. Their morality had to be scrutinized with extra caution. Their behavior had to be controlled, and their unstable emotions had to be restrained due to their perceived inherent weakness and the danger it represented. These types of typical misogynistic stereotypes, of course, did not originate with the myth of Pandora. The myth simply reflects the view that existed in ancient society. However, the narrative of Pandora's myth was certainly used as an argument to perpetuate these stereotypes and to vindicate them. Our next myths will explore the Danaïdes and Sisyphus. I mention them together as they've come to symbolize the same concept, while Pandora's box speaks to the calamities triggered by curiosity and carelessness. The stories of the Danaïdes and Sisyphus address the absurdity of laborious yet futile tasks. But first, the myth of the Danaïdes unfolds like this. Once upon a time, there were two twin brothers who were also kings. Danaus, who ruled over Libya and North Africa, and Aegyptus, who had conquered Egypt. Danaus had 50 daughters, the Danaïdes, and Aegyptus had 50 sons. The identical numbers of sons and daughters they each had, compounded by their fraternity, escalated the risk of a succession war ensuing upon the death of one king. To avert this, it was decided that the 50 daughters of Danaus and the 50 sons of Aegyptus would intermarry, forging strong ties between the two branches of the dynasty. However, as the wedding dates approached, Danaus consulted an oracle. The oracle revealed that the 50 sons of Aegyptus intended not to marry his daughters and live happily ever after, but rather to murder them all post-wedding to secure their rights to the inheritance. In response, Danaus decided to escape with his daughters. They all sailed from Libya to Greece, ultimately reaching Argos, a city where Danaus became king with the help of goddess Athena, who wished for Danaus to prosper and his reign to be mighty. Yet Aegyptus, the other brother, and his 50 sons would not accept this. Aegyptus ordered his sons to pursue Danaus and his daughters to Argos and to compel them to honor their promise of marriage. The 50 sons arrived in Greece and threatened to lay siege to Argos with their army. The city was inadequately defended, forcing Danaus to accept the inevitable situation. He conceded to the 50 weddings, but he could not dismiss the oracle's prediction. He remained convinced that his daughters would be killed the day after their weddings. So he instructed them to conceal long needles in their hair, and once their husbands had fallen asleep on their wedding night, to use these needles to pierce their hearts. And so it was done. The 50 marriages took place, were consummated, and when the son of Aegyptus fell asleep, the daughters of Danaus used their concealed needles and murdered them all, except for one. Hypermnestra spared her cousin and husband, Lynceus, because during their wedding night he had respected her wish to remain a virgin. She was touched by his respect and could not bring herself to kill him. Hypermnestra and Lynceus fled Argos, knowing that Danaus wouldn't let them live. As soon as Lynceus could assemble a small army, he returned to take revenge. He captured Argos and killed Danaus, along with his 49 murderous daughters. Lynceus and Hypermnestra then began a new dynasty of rulers in Argos. The myth supplied with an origin story for the kings of Argos, but it wasn't over for the 49 daughters. Having died, their souls descended to the underworld, the kingdom of god Hades, where they were judged for their actions for the murders of their cousins. They were sentenced to Tartarus, hell, where they were tasked with washing away their sins by filling a large bathtub with jugs of water. Only when the bathtub was full would they be allowed to escape from Tartarus. However, gods often enjoyed playing tricks on mortals and giving them false hopes, and Hades was no exception. The bathtub in this task had a leak, so every time the ladies would pour their jugs into it, all the water would escape due to the constant leak. The Danaïdes would forever attempt to fill the tub, condemning them to remain in hell for eternity. The story of the Danaïdes is more of a tragedy than a cautionary tale. Their complicity in the murders was dubious given that they had obeyed their father, a duty expected of daughters, and acted in self-defense. They were, in a sense, also victims in this story. But as we've seen with Pandora's tale and with many other myths, Greek gods were not always about justice, benevolence, and compassion. A similar punishment, one sounding more deserved this time, is the one inflicted on Sisyphus. So let's examine this other myth. Sisyphus was the founder and the first king of another significant city, Corinth. He was renowned for his cunning and effective rules, but was also greedy and deceitful. He frequently plotted and nursed grudges, even against his own brother, Salmoneus, also a king, whom he repeatedly attempted to kill or dethrone. Sisyphus was thus entangled in multiple tales of retaliation. One such example involved a feud with his neighbor, Autolycus. Autolycus, a son of the god Hermes, had inherited from his father the ability to steal cattle undetectably. He could transform the animals he stole to make them unrecognizable, preventing their rightful owners from claiming them. Sisyphus owned a large herd of oxen, and with Autolycus residing near Corinth, the thief began to steal some of the oxen under the cover of night. He transformed them to alter their appearance and added them to his own herd. Day after day, or night after night, Sisyphus saw his herd gradually thinning, while Autolycus's herd flourished. He harbored a strong suspicion of foul play, but couldn't accuse Autolycus of theft, as the animals no longer looked the same. To confirm his suspicions, Sisyphus devised a clever scheme. Secretly, he engraved his monogram on the hooves of his oxen. As usual, Autolycus came at night, stole a few of them, changed their appearance, and added them to his own herd. Upon dawn, Sisyphus simply had to follow the distinctive prints of his animals, which led him directly to Autolycus. There he accused him of theft using the monograms on the hooves as evidence. Autolycus was severely punished, but that was insufficient for Sisyphus. While the citizens were brutally handling the thief, he took advantage of the chaos to enter Autolycus' house and assault his daughter. On another occasion, Sisyphus interfered with the affairs of Zeus, a move that would set the stage for his downfall. Zeus had abducted the young and beautiful nymph named Aegina, who was the daughter of Asopus, the river god. As Zeus often did, he had set his eyes on this youthful beauty, but he knew that his wife, Hera, and her father, Asopus, would not accept this relationship, so he decided to capture Aegina and hide her, which would afford him the freedom to do as he pleased. Zeus transformed himself into an eagle to seize the nymph and transport her to a cave atop a mountain, a hideout she could not escape from. However, Sisyphus had witnessed the kidnapping. He knew where Aegina was concealed, and, armed with this valuable information, he approached Asopus. Of course, he would not divulge this information without a price, as it wasn't his nature to do so. He bartered the information for a favor. Asopus would grant him a magical spring located on the Acropolis of Corinth, a spring that could never run dry, in exchange for the whereabouts of his captive daughter. Asopus agreed. Sisyphus obtained his spring, and the river god was able to rescue his daughter, Aegina. Zeus felt offended and ridiculed, something he would not tolerate. As a result, he decided to punish Sisyphus severely. No intricate scheme was needed this time. Zeus simply summoned the god of death, Thanatos, and ordered him to secure Sisyphus, and ensured he'd be judged harshly upon his arrival in Hades, the world of the dead. Thanatos set out to confront Sisyphus. Unwilling to bow or accept his fate, the king of Corinth devised a trick. He offered to showcase some of his inventions to Thanatos as a personification of death. Thanatos seldom had entertainment opportunities. His existence revolved around visiting the living to conclude their earthly lives, so he agreed to explore the inventions. Sisyphus proceeded to show him a newly made pair of handcuffs. As the god of death inspected them with curiosity, Sisyphus locked them around his wrists, capturing the deity and later incarcerating him. Sisyphus had outsmart death itself, and as a result, people stopped dying. Zeus was irate and could not tolerate the suspension of death, so he summoned the god of war, Ares, and ordered him to free Thanatos and also escort Sisyphus to the world of the dead, a realm from which nearly no one could ever return. And so it was done. Ares traveled to Corinth, freed Thanatos, who could resume his duties, seized Sisyphus, and escorted him across the river Styx, the boundary marking the entrance to the kingdom of Hades. Yet again, Sisyphus had foreseen this. He understood well that capturing Thanatos would not conclude his conflicts with Zeus. So before another deity was summoned to detain him, he instructed his wife to forego arranging a funeral for his deceased body. She was to leave his body on the bed and prevent anyone from burying her husband, an order she obeyed. Meanwhile, Sisyphus was presented to Hades to be judged. The king argued that he couldn't enter the realm of the dead until his remains were buried properly. He proposed a temporary return to the world of the living to take care of the funeral preparations, promising he would return afterward to accept whatever judgment Hades deemed fitting. Much like Thanatos before him, Hades was unaccustomed to such duplicitous behavior from mortals. He was unaware that Sisyphus hadn't been given a proper funeral due to his own explicit directions. So the lord of the underworld agreed to release Sisyphus temporarily in exchange for his promise to quickly settle his funeral arrangements. Once he returned to the world of the living, his lifeless body miraculously came back to life. Yet, interestingly, he held no intention of returning to the underworld. Therefore, he didn't proceed with his own funeral and instead resumed his life. He had cheated death for the second time, making a mockery of the gods. This time, the gods concurred that this defiance could not continue any further. Thanatos was summoned once again to deliver Sisyphus to Hades, where he was sentenced to spend eternity in Tartarus. But Zeus and Hades contrived a special punishment for the man who believed he could outsmart them. Sisyphus would have to perpetually roll a boulder up a steep hill in Tartarus. The boulder was enchanted to evade Sisyphus before he reached the hill's peak, subjecting the deposed king to an eternity of fruitless efforts and constant frustration. This punish imprisoned him in a state of perpetual unfulfillment. As we tell these stories and enjoy a moment's respite, somewhere in the underworld, Sisyphus eternally pushes his boulder in the hope that he'll surmount the hill this time. Yet, predictably, the boulder rolls down the incline and he must descend to resume his eternal task. Sisyphus was ultimately punished for his hubris, that is, his excessive pride and overconfidence in his abilities. He forgot this mortal condition and elicited devastating consequences on himself. Primarily on himself, but many Greek myths caution against hubris, especially in sovereigns and powerful individuals. This blend of overconfidence and pride could invite disasters upon an entire population. Consider, for instance, the risk of provoking divine wrath or instigating war without fully contemplating the ramifications. Another well-known myth that serves as a cautionary tale of hubris is the myth of Icarus. To conclude tonight's story, let's revisit it. Icarus was the son of a talented architect, Daedalus, who was employed by the king of Crete. King Minos, the king, commissioned Daedalus to design and construct the labyrinth, a vast maze where he placed the Minotaur, a creature half bull, half man. The hero who defied King Minos entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and found his way back with the aid of a ball of string given by Ariadne, Minos's daughter. He traced the thread back to the entrance and escaped from Crete with Ariadne to return safe and sound. The tale of Icarus unfolds after these events. King Minos was infuriated by the death of the Minotaur, the betrayal, and the loss of his daughter, not to mention her escape with Theseus. The labyrinth was now vacant, and Theseus had evaded its traps. The situation called for punishment, and the unfortunate recipients were Daedalus and his son Icarus. The architect was imprisoned within his own labyrinth. However, despite being the labyrinth's creator, it was too vast and intricate for Daedalus to recall the entire layout and discern the way out. It seemed that the father and son were doomed to die of starvation. Yet the architect was intelligent and resourceful. Within the labyrinth, he discovered various materials and crafted wings from them. These wings were constructed from feathers and held together with beeswax. Affixed to their arms, Daedalus and Icarus could mimic the flapping of birds' wings. The strategy worked, and soon Daedalus and Icarus rose above the labyrinth, intending to fly away from Crete and return to Greece. However, beforehand, Daedalus had warned his son about the fragility of the wings. He cautioned him not to ascend too high or too close to the sun, as heat would melt the wax, nor should he fly too close to the sea, as the feathers could get wet and cease to be effective. Icarus vowed to adhere to his father's instructions. The pair then began their escape, leaving the island behind and flying over the sea. The fear and anxiety of confinement dissipated as their escape proved successful, filling Icarus with increasing joy and confidence. So confident, in fact, he disregarded his father's counsel and soared skyward, even higher. He was curious to see the world from such great heights and intent on discovering how high he could ascend. As he continued, he drew closer and closer to the sun, causing the heat to gradually melt the beeswax that held the feathers together. One by one, they drifted down like snowfall, but all Icarus did was gaze skyward, oblivious to his predicament. He kept flapping his arms until he realized that he was no longer ascending. He glanced at his wings and saw that he was merely flapping his bare arms. His wings were no more. As a result, Icarus plummeted from the sky like a stone and fell into the sea, where he drowned. The lesson from this tale is rather straightforward. Icarus had everything he needed to ensure a successful escape. He had even been warned about the dangers of ascending too high. However, his overconfidence and lack of pragmatism made him overlook these cautionary points, leading to his literal and metaphorical downfall. This myth has endured the passage of centuries, giving way to the popular phrase, flying too close to the sun. The story has also caught the attention of modern psychologists and psychiatrists who recognize the psychological pattern it represents. This pattern, known as a form of overcompensation, describes individuals who entertain grandiose aspirations despite having insufficient means because they lack realism or are overcompensating, or feelings of inferiority by erring on the side of extremes. This is what inspired the proposition of the term Icarus complex. In its original form, this myth cautions against not only flying too high, but also too low, both of which would be harmful. This tale can be interpreted as an invitation to find and maintain an appropriate balance. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you can pick another story from my library. I will be back soon with a new one. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.